Karen was full of fun and full of life. Karen was only a child herself at the age of 20 and 5 months pregnant. We were extremely happy about the fact that she was having a baby. Karen was so thrilled about it. It was just something we were all looking forward to. What happened to Karen just doesn't happen every day. She's obviously got in a car with someone and it's all gone wrong from there. Karen could possibly have been Mallatt's first victim.
He murdered 7 backpackers in the 1990s. Australia's most notorious killer.
Mallett is a psychopath. He is a textbook psychopath.
But Ivan Milat had even darker secrets.
This is the untold story of Ivan Milat.
Now, 2 of Australia's top criminal investigators asked the question: were the Belanglo 7 Mallat's only murders?
Dozens of other victims, many more killing fields.
This is going to shock a lot of people.
Where are his other hunting grounds? How many more did he kill?
This is a horrifying list of potential victims.
It's staggering, isn't it?
This is the deepest anyone has ever dug into Ivan Mallat's killing ground.
He got away with murder.
It's like it was swept under the rug.
He's learning. Serial killers learn their craft.
And they're brought to a place where nobody would hear them scream.
I just knew something wasn't right.
They disappeared.
I said, what? Shot or stabbed to death.
This fits exactly with Mallett.
It's heartbreaking.
I struggle with this.
I've no doubt there are more victims.
The main question is, how many more?
It's so quiet. It's very eerie.
It was in February 1971 that Karen Rowland was murdered and her body was left right here in this pine forest in Canberra.
20 years of age and 5 months pregnant, exactly 50 years on, and nobody has been charged with her murder.
And I do believe that Ivan Milat is responsible for Karen Rowland's murder and that she was probably his very first murder victim.
20 years before, the 7 backpackers were murdered in the Belanglo State Forest.
And I'm certain that Ivan Milat is responsible for many more murders.
Criminal psychologist Watson-Munro has delved into the minds of Australia's most depraved criminals. From tycoons to terrorists, underworld gangsters, and the notorious Hoddle Street killer.
I've assessed approximately 30,000 offenders. Serial killers, mass murderers, rapists. I've dealt with many psychopaths, tens of thousands of them.
Forensic anthropologist and criminologist Dr. Xanthe Mallett is world-renowned for digging up new clues in old cases.
I specialise in reinvestigating cold cases, and I've worked with police forces across Australia.
We have this interest in unsolved crimes, psychopaths, what it is that drives people.
They plan to uncover the new murders, the new victims of Ivan Milat.
We're convinced that Mallett is responsible for many other crimes, and we're going to prove it.
We know that there are more victims out there, and one of the cases I've followed very closely is Karen Rowland.
I'm Steve Rowland. I'm Karen Rowland's brother. Karen was my biggest sister. She always got on with everyone. Just really happy, friendly, loving person. She was tragically murdered 50 years ago, and we still to this date have no idea as to why or what has happened.
Karen Rowland went missing one night after running out of fuel on the streets of Canberra.
A young woman robbed of her life, not to mention the life of the unborn baby.
And her body wasn't found until 3 months later in a nearby pine forest, with pine needles scattered over her remains.
Exactly like Mallatt's other victims.
Steve, her brother, and the rest of the family have been waiting over 50 years for answers.
We've been, I wouldn't say let down, but I think we've just been avoided, perhaps. I'd really love to see the case to be revisited in today's terms rather than how it was done 50 years ago. We need to know why and how. I mean, it's something that's just got to be done. I've been given a lot of help by Hugh, who is my cousin, who lives in Wales. He's the driving force that's helped reignite the case to try and find out what did happen to Karen.
I live in Aberystwyth, mid Wales coast, right on the far west side of the United Kingdom. I was in the police force for 30 years. About 22 of those years was as a detective. I worked an awful lot within crime intelligence. I was involved directly in a dozen homicide investigations. I've been studying Karen's case closely, I would say for certainly the last 3 years, but I've had a general interest in it for the last 30 years. Words can't describe how close it is and how close the family and Karen's family are to my heart. I'm not convinced that Karen's case has ever been fully reviewed. My investigations of the murder have been limited. Having any form of an investigation of a case that's 11,000 miles away is extremely difficult. We've been told nothing. The family have been told nothing.
Karen Rowland's family has spent decades waiting for answers, and sadly, they aren't the only ones. I believe that Karen's death is one of many other murders by Ivan Milat, including innocent young travellers from all over the world.
Like Lydia Knotts, the 21-year-old German backpacker who disappeared in Brisbane in 1976.
And 22-year-old American backpacker Barbara Brown, who vanished whilst hitchhiking from Sydney in 1978.
15 and 16-year-old Tony Kavanagh and Kay Doherty, who disappeared from a bus stop in 1979.
Annika Adrianson and Alan Fox, young hitchhikers who also went missing in 1979.
And Peter Letcher, 18 years old, hitchhiking in 1987, later found murdered.
Young mother Diane Panaccio, who was murdered in 1991.
20 lives taken, possibly more.
From Karen in 1971 right through to the early 1990s, this is a horrifying list of potential victims.
20 years of serial killing, and Milat wasn't convicted of any of them. He's a marauding serial killer, but he's an opportunist as well. He's working with main roads, on job sites, driving up and down the Hume Highway. Wherever Milat seems to be working or travelling, women and men are disappearing and being killed.
Mallat's favourite hunting ground was the Hume Highway, between Western Sydney and the Belanglo State Forest. From the late 1980s, he prowled this stretch of highway, preying on young, vulnerable travellers.
It was the age of, Crocodile Dundee and Paul Hogan. The soapies were really having a big impact on UK TV. So Australia was getting a lot of coverage in international media as a safe haven, a happy place. British and international backpackers came to Australia in search of adventure. It was a great place to get away from mum and dad.
It's hard to know where to start. Caroline was the youngest of our three children. Caring, happy, thoughtful, a great sense of fun. It was never short of laughter when she was around. We were very pleased when we heard she was going to Australia because so many of her friends had been and come back and sung its praises.
Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters flew to Australia separately. They didn't know each other before they arrived here, but they met each other while living in backpacker hostels and going to bars, and that's when they forged a very strong friendship. These girls had no fear about hitchhiking. They'd hitchhiked on a number of occasions in the past and felt quite safe about it. They eventually left on that April day in 1992. They caught a train out to Casula, and their intention was then to go to the Hume Highway and start hitching on the Hume Highway and get down to the southern part of New South Wales. Joanne and Caroline would ring home every week. They would send postcards to their families on a regular basis to say what they were doing and where they were going. And suddenly, all that communication had stopped.
When she missed Emma, our daughter's birthday at the beginning of May, that really did start to ring alarm bells. Our car phone rang, and it was our policeman that was looking after us. He just said, pull into the side of the road. I've got bad news. And that's when we knew.
The bodies of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters were found in the Belanglo State Forest.
It was certainly by far the biggest investigation that I have ever been involved in.
Chief Superintendent Clive Small handed one of Australia's biggest murder investigations.
About 51 detectives were attached to the backpacker investigation team.
A task force was formed, 300 police drafted into the search.
We can do it, and we will do it.
There was always a lot of speculation about how many more bodies were going to be found.
2 have been found dead, and there are mounting police fears this site could turn into a backpacker's graveyard.
The backpackers came from the UK, Germany, and a few from Australia, and that gave it a huge international impact.
6 international tourists have gone missing in Australia, including 2 British girls.
German hitchhiker Simone Schmidl.
Australische Polizei hat in einem Wald
2 other Germans, Gabo Neugebauer and Anja Habshid.
6 und 7 eines Serienmörders.
There was something about the murder of visitors to our country which really seemed to touch a nerve in the Australian psyche that, Australians see themselves as friendly and welcoming, and yet here we were killing our guests.
Covered with branches and leaf litter, the bodies had been there for almost 4 years.
The first murder was of an Australian couple in December 1989, just before New Year's Eve, and the last murder was in Easter 1992. the British pair, Caroline Clarke and Joanne Walters.
Ivan Milat wanted people who could go missing and not be reported missing for some time. He wanted to make sure that most of his victims didn't have relatives or close friends in Australia who would report their disappearance within a few days. The 7 young victims were either shot or stabbed to death, and not just with one shot, not with just one knife wound.
Stabbed in the lower back, gagged, blindfolded, and shot 10 times in the head.
These were attacks which were brutal. Belanglo Forest is a very eerie place at the best of times. When you go deep into the forest, you realise how vulnerable these people were. There was no escape. And you think about what must have gone through their minds before they were killed.
Caroline Clarke and Joanne Walters were the first to be found, although they were the last ones killed. Found here in September 1992.
And it took searchers another year to find the bodies of James Gibson and Deborah Everest. They went missing in 1989, but were not found until 1993.
And a month later, the police found the remains of German backpacker Simon Schmidl, who disappeared in 1991.
And the other German backpackers, Anja Habschied and Gabor Nugabar, they went missing in 1991 and were discovered in 1993.
You can see Milat's pattern. All the bodies were left pretty close to fire trails so that he could drive them to a certain point. I think the only way we're going to get a real sense of what it was like to be there is to go to Mallat's killing field.
All the bodies are within 3.5 kilometre radius of this point. Remote bushland, pine plantations, not too far from the road. Easy for him to find, but very difficult for people to stumble across.
We're actually at the memorial for the 7 known victims. You've got to wonder what the likelihood is that we found all of Mallat's victims.
I've no doubt there are more victims because it goes back certainly to about 1971, and that gives it another 18 years in terms of his operating period.
So in terms of the actual location of the Belanglo 7, we know that they're all buried in very similar circumstances. Just off fire trails, say between 300 and 500 metres. Not exactly buried, but kind of in depressions, shallow graves, covered in leaf litter. An attempt to cover them, but not so much that he couldn't come back later. And I think the reason for that is because he wants to spend time there and enjoy what he's doing.
And they're brought to a place where nobody would hear them scream. So down here is the turn-off to the grave sites for Caroline Clarke and Joanne Walters.
Joanne Walters' body was found just close to the rock. And then Caroline Clarke was found slightly this way, about 30 metres away.
Mm. You can only imagine the terror that Joanne and Caroline were experiencing as they're being led up here by Mallett.
This is the clearing. Both girls were found, you know, the shallow depressions that we've been talking about, all kind of hidden by the log.
And these logs act as a perfect marker for him.
Mm-hmm.
With the rock as a marker from the road.
Yeah, yeah. And he obviously wanted to spend quite a lot of time here. You know, he wanted to come back even, you know, months, a year later.
Well, they found empty alcohol containers, Cigarette butts. They found .22 casings from a Ruger. He clearly came back and he enjoyed the experience, savouring his kills. It's staggering, isn't it? He's a true psychopath who has no remorse, no empathy. He would have enjoyed the power, the control, and watching them suffer because he's a sadist. It'd be living hell.
If you think how dense it is and, you know, how remote, it's extraordinary that they were found at all.
Totally extraordinary.
And even though we found 7, the main question is, how many more?
An extraordinary turn in the backpackers case.
A suspect has emerged in the backpacker killings.
Police in Australia are questioning a 49-year-old man in connection with the murder of 7 backpackers.
Ivan Milat was accused of killing 7 backpackers between December 1989 and April 1992.
In March 1996, Ivan Milat stood trial for the 7 backpacker murders and the abduction of British man Paul Onions. Families of the international victims, like the Clarks, flew from the other side of the world to see this man brought to justice.
There were 9 counts on which he was being tried, and we knew that if he was found guilty on the first one, that we were home and dry. We knew if we got that first guilty, that we were okay.
The Clarks remained in court, listening as the prosecution led sensational new evidence against Ivan Milat.
It just kept coming through. Guilty, guilty, guilty. All 9. We'd got him.
This cruel killer of 7 young tourists will spend the rest of his life in jail.
Australia's worst serial killer.
When Milat was convicted of the 7 killings, he went to jail. The police stopped investigating the other crimes that he could have been responsible for. They hoped that he might make a confession. He didn't, and the bastard got away with it.
There are a number of cases that he may have been involved in. It would be lovely to pin those on him and give comfort to those poor parents who have been waiting decades to find what happened to their loved ones. And we know what a torment it was for us. But I just feel so deeply for all those who still don't know.
No one has ever been held accountable for taking Karen and a baby's life. And that's the bit that we would dearly love to know.
20 years before the Belanglo murders, Karen Rowland was killed in Canberra. Did her murder match Milat's MO? What happened on that summer's day in 1971?
Wanted number 36 opening. Take 1.
The Crime Hunt, made in cooperation with the police, in which you become a television detective.
In Wanted tonight, we have 2 most intriguing mysteries. The first concerns this girl, Karen Rowlands, who vanished in Canberra late last February and whose body was found nearly 3 months later. How did Karen die?
On Karen's last day, Karen had gone to work. Then she'd been out to have her hair done. She was in great spirits, like really good spirits. And then my sisters, Chris and Karen, were going out then that evening to a hotel, and it just all went wrong from there.
It was sort of on the spur of the moment that she planned to go back to Canberra.
She met up with her sister and her sister's fiancé and the friend at about 9:15. And then she headed off ahead of the other three. They went in one car, she was in her Mini.
They've travelled down Parks Way and Keren's run out of fuel. Chris and John have continued on. It was then, I believe, they've noticed that Keren wasn't behind and they waited and waited and waited and then thought it's probably just best if they went home.
Well, it was just up here that she ran out of petrol.
Yeah.
50 years ago, there'd be no traffic.
She hasn't got a mobile phone, obviously, so she can't call anyone.
She's vulnerable. She's 20 years of age. She's 5 months pregnant.
So she's basically stuck here, no fuel. It's 9 o'clock at night, it's dark, there are no street lights. You know, she's either going to walk down the road in the dark or she's going to have to accept a lift.
You've got no options, really. And a person turns up in a car, offers a lift. And of course, 50 years ago, people were far more trusting.
And we know that there were at least 3 witnesses that saw this. So we've got the first witness sees her getting out of the car, so obviously she's run out of petrol. A second witness sees her walking towards the back of a dark vehicle. And then we've got a third witness that actually sees the driver of that vehicle leaning over to let her in.
All she'd be thinking about is getting out of here because it's dangerous. That's the irony. She hops into a very dangerous situation to get away from one.
I think Keren trusted everyone. Someone's come along, she's thought that maybe this person can help me out with fuel or whatever. I mean, wrong place, wrong time, and I'm sure that's what's happened with Keren.
So this is the route that they probably would have taken if they were heading to the closest petrol station that would have been open at this time. Now, so as we approach the memorial, Keren would have been expecting to turn left, but instead we think that they turned right.
Yeah, so it's about this point she's starting to wonder what's going on, I suspect, and starting to panic. And,
So at some point she realises something's wrong because we've got a witness that says that they saw a woman in a car and she was screaming.
The possible last known sighting of Keren was reports of the gun gates at Duntroon running from a car.
They saw a dark-coloured sedan car on the grass verge on the opposite side of the road to which it should be facing. And they describe a young girl fitting Keren's description running from the car back in towards Canberra. That might well have been the last time Keren was seen.
Keren was missing straight away. We knew it was out of character. We told the police, yes, they did find the car, but there was no forensic work, there was nothing. It was traumatic for Mum and Dad in particular, and we almost immediately started searching. Where is Keren, you know? Have you seen this girl? We had no idea for 3 months as to what had happened to her.
There's about 6 pieces of fate, coincidences, there's so many of them, and I can go over in my mind, we all do at home, saying if only we hadn't such and such, if only we hadn't have been with her, you know, if only Mum hadn't let her out, but it's no, you know, it's no good saying this because Keren's gone now, there's nothing we can do. This is how, I mean, we have accepted it. It's hard to get used to though.
The day that Karen was found, my uncle, Dad's brother, came into work to pick me up. And when he come through the door, I knew why he was there. And, yeah, he said, you better come home. And if nothing else, at least we knew.
Karen's body was found approximately 3 months after her initial disappearance, and she was found in the pine plantation up near the Air Disaster Memorial, which is beyond Canberra Airport, heading towards Queanbeyan.
The thing that strikes me is the similarity to the Belanglo. Isolated, and of course she was in a shallow grave covered by pine needles, as were the others.
Yeah, and this fits his MO exactly. The environment, the type of location, you know, very shallow grave, loose leaf litter, trying to cover the body but not burying because you want to come back, you want to relive that. So this fits exactly with Mallett.
I think possibly it's his first one. It's 20 years before the others. But he's built up to finessing his technique. So this might have been random. The next one's it's hitchhikers, and he becomes from an opportunist to a predator.
There are certain similarities with regards to the area in which Karen was dumped and the area in which the backpackers were found. This was likely to be Mallett's first victim, and he's learning. He learns his craft. Serial killers learn their craft.
From the way Karen's body was found, she was about 16 feet from the road. She was in kind of a straight line, as if she'd been dragged.
Yes, and there's clothing all over the place.
There's been a lot of talk in relation to Ivan Milat having had something to do with Karen's murder. I can give a lot of reasons as to why it could be him. I can't find an answer as to why it isn't him.
Witnesses suggest they've seen a dark-coloured car, and one of the witnesses claims that the car was maroon. There is a suggestion that Ivan Milat had access and was driving a Ford Fairmont, which was gold in colour. It's a dark-coloured gold that in dim light will appear maroon. Is there any chance that that was Ivan Millat's car that was in front of Karen? Can we rule it out? Tell me why it can't be Ivan Milat.
Still to come.
There was something not right.
Another Milat victim is unearthed.
A shallow grave, pine needles.
That's heartbreaking.
There's a bit of a pattern emerging here, this arc of evil.
Karen Rowland's murder has never been officially linked to Ivan Milat. Her cousin Hugh has spent the last 3 years investigating her case from 17,000 kilometres away. He's kept an open mind about Karen's killer, but all paths keep leading back to Milat.
I vividly remember in the late 90s sitting down with Jeff, Karen's father, when the Mallett case was in court, and saying to him, is there any chance that this guy could be responsible? With the work that I've done, I've found out that in 1994-95, Mallett was considered a suspect in Karen's case, and yet the family didn't know that.
The examination of the history and the records of Mallett show that he was working in the area, so he had the opportunity, and there was similarity between the future backpacker murders and her murder in terms of the way it was carried out and the body was left.
Ivan Milat was 26 years old in February 1971, a killer in the making. 20 years later, another unsolved murder near Canberra, which also bore the distinctive mark of Milat. Diane Pinocchio was killed in Bungendore in 1991. By then, Ivan Milat was 46 and at the peak of his murder spree.
I'm Bill White, brother of Diane Pinocchio, and this is my wife, Vicky. Diane, or Dude, as we all called her, was outgoing sort of girl, very cheeky.
She just loved life, loved people, very happy, happy always. And when you met her, you never forgot her. She was just a person you could never forget. She was just a beautiful person. A very loving mother. She did love that little Jack very much. And loved her husband. Jack was only 2 or 3 years old, and he was a wild little fella.
At the time, Vicky and I owned the Royal Hotel at Bungendore. That Friday night, Diane's husband, Carmen, told Diane, yeah, you go out and see Bill and Vic, and I'll stay home and babysit Jack and go out and enjoy yourself. We kicked back and had a few drinks. When it come closing time, she asked me if I'd drive her back to Queanbeyan. And Vic said, well, wait till we clean up. She said, I'll drive you back if you want. And she said, don't worry, I've got a lift back. I've got a ride.
Apparently she didn't have a lift. And she walked up the road to the other hotel, and she asked around the pub, is anyone going back to Queanbeyan?
But that's the last time we seen her when she was out the front.
We didn't know she hadn't got home until Carmen rang us on the Monday. When we got the call, we just knew something wasn't good. There was something not right.
Carmen was Diane's husband. All he could really tell us was that she'd disappeared, it was out of character for her, and he had no idea where she would be. Initially, we kept a fairly open mind. We conducted a fairly thorough investigation looking for her. Of course, our hopes were that she was okay. About 3 months later, in November 1991, 2 forestry workers were patrolling the Belanglo State Forest, a dense pine forest between Bungendore and Queanbeyan. They located the remains of a female under a tree stump and covered in pine needles.
It had already hit the news. And I seen it on the news as Bill pulled up from work. I said, Bill, come and watch this. And as I said that, I looked out the window and seen the paddy wagon pull up in the driveway. I just knew something wasn't right.
They'd found her in the forest.
We're told that she was strangled and stabbed. There was a boning knife or something, they explained. And that her body was put in like a log and packed with pine needles.
Diane's death happened in September 1991, between the killing of Simone Schmidl and the double murder of Gabor Neugebauer and Anya Habshi. So Milat was actively hunting at the time. After the break,
Milat may have been in the hotel.
The evidence is mounting.
We were able to put two and two together and say this is a very, very strong suspect here.
So this is actually one of the last places Diane was seen.
The pub was owned by her brother and her sister-in-law, and they were wanting her to stay the night. We know that she leaves the hotel at about midnight. She says she has a ride organised down at the next pub. There were some main road drinkers there. Milat, of course, worked for Main Roads at that time.
When we did our first canvass on the Friday after she went missing, there were workers who had been working in the area that day. Milat may have been one of those people working at Bungadore that day and had been in the hotel. Looking back, I believe that there's a strong possibility that Milat may have been in that hotel. He may have seen her leave the hotel or heard her asking for a lift home and volunteered to drive her home.
He would never fear people, never feared anybody, that anyone would do her harm. You know, she wouldn't fear to get into a car or get in with anyone. She just would never think they would hurt her or harm her.
So this is the last place she was seen alive.
She's vulnerable, she's on her own. For a predator, that's ideal.
It was also raining, and so that may have been an added incentive for her to hop into a stranger's car.
But we know that she got a lift with somebody because she's not found till 2 months later in a pine forest.
A shallow grave, pine needles, very similar to other people, including Milat's victims in Belanglo. And there's a bit of a pattern emerging here, this arc of evil.
There's just a lot of different things that are kind of adding up to being very similar to Milat's MO.
It wasn't until Milat came on the scene that we were able to put two and two together and say this is a very, very strong suspect here. One of the things that Milat was renowned for was collecting souvenirs from his victims. We know that Diane had a gold chain on and also some earrings and also some keys to the house. They were never found.
The last time we spoke to police about Diane was 15 years ago.
It's like it was swept under the rug. We never heard nothing about it.
I'd like to see a result. But 29 years, and we don't know whether they've kept any DNA that they found on Diane or whether it's just been passed over and forgotten, I don't know. But to get an answer of who killed her, that's what I'll be looking for. It's heartbreaking. heartbreaking.
All of the circumstances were similar to the Belanglo murders and gave cause for suspicion. However, there was not enough evidence there to implicate Ivan Milat.
In hindsight, and everything that I've seen, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say that there was a 9.5 chance of Milat being responsible for Diane Panacio's murder.
There was one murder that Ivan wasn't charged with, but which I believe he committed. That was late '87, where I believe he murdered Peter Letcher.
Peter Letcher was murdered just before the Belanglo killings began. He was on his way home from visiting his girlfriend in Sydney when he accepted a lift from his killer. Peter was repeatedly shot and stabbed, and the crime had all the hallmarks of Ivan Milat. The tragedy for his family is that no one has ever been charged with his murder.
Peter Letcher was just 18 years old when he disappeared in 1987 from Busby, which is close to Liverpool, one of Milat's known haunts. And he left the city and hitchhiked his way home, and he was going to Bathurst as his final destination.
But he never made it. Somewhere along the highway, hitchhiking presumably, he's picked up in a car, presumably Milat's, and a detour is made along one of these roads to the Jenolan Caves. He's found 3 months later in the Belanglo State Forest, the height of summer.
Peter had been shot several times in the head, 5 times, I believe it was, and a number of bullets were also found in the ground around him. They were 22 bullets.
His body was suffering severe decomposition, but it had a lot of chilling similarities to the backpacker murders. He was found under branches. He'd been stabbed in the back. He'd been shot in the head, with his head having been covered in a manner very similar to Carolyn Clark's.
Yes, it did have similarities to the backpackers in terms that the body was laid out on the ground in a bit of a hole. It had been covered by leaves and branches, but also the actual murder itself, the stabbing and the shooting.
So who was Peter Letcher? Well, he grew up in Bathurst, one of 4 kids, and I've spoken to his father, Brian, who says that Peter was just a happy, normal little boy. But as he moved into his teenage years, apparently he fell in with a rough crowd, and there's some suggestion he may have been involved with selling drugs, and that may have had something to do with his murder.
If you look at the way that he was murdered and the place that he was murdered, it suggests that Milat has to be the #1 suspect.
Jenolan State Forest is 3 hours' drive west of Sydney, across the rugged Blue Mountains. It's an isolated place, a dangerous place.
Milat, all he's got to do is drive down the highway and pick up innocent people, and they are captives. Out here, you're really vulnerable.
Peter Letcher was only 18. You know, he's just young, probably, you know, a bit naive. Somebody just offers you a lift. You know, you're going to take it, aren't you?
To save a few shillings.
Yep. He must have appeared pretty normal.
You know, there's charming Ivan, and then there's the real Ivan, who's the cunning psychopath. And at some point, there's a switch.
Can you imagine the terror? You're driving along, you think you're going Sydney to Bathurst, and suddenly the driver takes a detour into a pine forest.
He has virtually total control over his victim.
You're literally trapped, aren't you? And there's only a few responses at that point. You know, what are you going to do? You're going to fight your way out? Mallett was a well-built guy, not that tall, but, you know, muscular, strong.
And, you know, he leans down, pulls out a gun.
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
You can try and talk your way out of it. You're wondering whether you're going to be killed, whether you're going to be sexually abused, or both. You're now just buying time, praying for some sort of intervention, which is never going to come. It's very eerie.
We should be pretty close to the spot. This should be probably about the spot. We're about 11 metres in from the road, which is where Peter's body was located. He was found in a shallow depression created by a tree having fallen over and the root system exposed at a dip, covered in some loose leaf litter just from the forest floor. Obviously, pretty similar to some of the other situations we've seen.
It's striking how similar it is to Belanglo. Same forest scenario. There's logs, there's a shallow grave. Not far from the fire trail, and points of reference where Mallett could come in and relive the experience. It's also very similar to the crash memorial site in Canberra for Karen Rowland. The similarities really are extraordinary.
When police went to search Ivan's employment records, they found that he was due to start work on that very road where Letcher was found the following Monday. Work colleagues of his speculated that Ivan would often scout out a job before they did it. They would talk about him just going off driving long distances, often at night. They were never sure exactly what he was doing, but they knew there was something mysterious going on. The coincidence is extraordinary, and this one's hard to go past.
Peter Letcher died violently. His murder strikingly similar to the Belanglo killings that would shock the world 5 years later. But police had no reason to suspect Ivan Milat for Peter's death. He just wasn't on their radar. They were convinced Peter was killed by local drug dealers in a dispute over money.
So at the inquest into Peter's death, the coroner found he'd been shot 5 times in the head by person or persons unknown. But then comes Belanglo, and the police start thinking, remember the Peter Letcher case. Given all the similarities to the 7 backpacker murders, they start wondering if Mallett could be good for Peter Letcher's murder too.
Police were pretty keen to link the Letcher murder to the backpacker murders, but they were asked not to do it during the trial because the prosecutor didn't want things to be confused. So as soon as the trial finished, they hot-footed it out there and conducted a search of the area.
Police today continued their painstaking search of the Belanglo State Forest.
They didn't find anything more to add to the case against Mallett.
Without any fresh evidence from the crime scene, police hoped the .22 rifle that killed Peter could be linked to the one used by Mallett at Belanglo.
My name's Gerard Dutton, and I'm a sergeant in the Tasmania Police ballistics section. But at the time of the backpacker murders, I was working for the New South Wales Police.
Sergeant Gerard Dutton described to the backpacker jury how guns leave unique microscopic marks on fired bullets and cartridge cases.
I believe that the evidence circumstantially indicates Ivan Milat was responsible for Peter Letcher's death. I was involved in the backpacker case from the very start when they found the first two bodies in the Belanglo Forest.
The bodies of Carolyn Clark and Joanne Walters were found in bush graves.
We found that Carolyn Clark had been shot 10 times in the head with a .22 calibre weapon, and we recovered 7 bullets from inside her skull, as well as 3 bullets in the soil where her head was lying at the scene.
When Mallett was arrested, Gerard took part in the search of his home on the outskirts of Sydney. Here, police made a breakthrough that would be crucial in convicting him.
Hidden in a wall cavity in the front wall of Mallett's house were some firearm components. I was very excited because I instantly recognised them as components of a Ruger 10-22 rifle. When I sat down at the microscope with my test firings using Mallett's breech bolt and compared that to the Clark murder cases, I distinctly remember the hairs on the back of my neck standing up straight because the evidence was irrefutable. They matched, which meant that that breech bolt was fitted to the murder gun. One of the things we would do in the ballistics section is compare the cartridge cases and bullets that we recovered to other unsolved shootings, because sometimes we find that the same firearm had been used and we can link these crimes. After thinking about the types of graves we encountered in the Belanglo Forest, it threw my mind back to when I was a junior ballistics officer in the latter part of the 1980s. And I went to a scene where Peter Letcher had been shot dead numerous times in the head. And the body was found secreted but not buried, covered with bush litter like branches, twigs and so on. Exactly like 7 bodies that we found in the Belanglo Forest. Similar graves, similar location, similar savagery in the way that these people had been dispatched. Letcher had been shot numerous times in the head from a .22 rifle. It's not usual with murder victims that we find them shot multiple times in the head. And the fact that Carolyn Clark had been shot 10 times and Gabor Neugebauer 6 times, just those few circumstantial indicators, to me, would suggest Ivan Milat was also responsible. And so I compared the Clark murder exhibits to all of our .22 calibre unsolved crime exhibits in the section.
But when Gerard carried out the ballistic comparison, he hit a brick wall.
The Ruger 10-22 was not used to kill Peter Letcher, that was used to kill Carolyn Clark. That's definitive. It was a .22 calibre firearm. Whether it was a revolver, rifle or a pistol, I don't know. But Ivan Milat owned a lot of firearms and did a lot of shooting. Whether it was another firearm owned by him, I can't say.
Gerard couldn't link Milat to Peter Letcher's murder weapon. Yet he still believes the murder was so similar to the Belanglo killings, especially Caroline Clark's, that he can only draw one conclusion.
My belief is that Letcher was most likely killed by Ivan Milat. It seems far-fetched to think that some other unknown person has killed Peter Letcher in such a similar fashion.
But like so many other murders in which Milat was a suspect, the case was never solved.
I'm quite confident, I'd say satisfied, that he killed Peter Letcher, but the evidence wasn't strong enough at the time to charge Ivan Milat with the murder. There just wasn't enough there, and particularly given the other cases that were being worked on at the time, we wanted to ensure that there wasn't a disruption to them.
I think there is a strong likelihood that Milat was involved in the murder of Peter Letcher.
But as Ivan Milat had already been put away for life and convicted of the backpacker murders, it was felt there was very little point in reopening the case and prosecuting Ivan Milat again for the murder of Peter Letcher, so they decided to let it rest.
In a moment...
When I saw him, he was in full predatory mode.
The one that got away.
He jumped out, he grabbed the hammer from the tailgate, and I realised then there was going to be trouble.
In the Jenolan area west of Sydney, the search for clues to Peter Letcher's fate continues. Our investigators are pursuing a lead that further implicates Ivan Milat in Peter's murder.
There's little doubt that Milat was active in this area around the right time, because we have evidence from another British backpacker, Colin Powis, who was picked up by Milat in 1982. He managed to get out of Ivan Milat's car and basically escape.
And that happened right here, only about 30 kilometres down the road from the forest where Peter Letcher's body was found.
I came to Australia in 1982, and I just turned 21 years old. I came to Australia because I had a kind of wanderlust. At that age, I was kind of naive and gullible. I didn't really understand how dangerous it could be. I'd only been in Australia for 48 hours, and I started hitchhiking then. So I was stood by the side of the road about 9 o'clock in the morning in Blackheath. And then suddenly a pickup truck came and stopped for me. And when I went to throw my backpack in the back of his vehicle, a fella jumped out and said, don't do that, mate. Put it here in the cab because it's safer. And I thought that was bizarre, because the back of the pickup truck was empty apart from a large masonry hammer. And when I saw it there, what went off in my head was, oh, this guy must be a bricklayer too. I got in, and the driver told me, put your seatbelt on, mate. So I put my seatbelt on, and then he pointed over and he said, put that button down. And I looked at him like, why would you want to tell that to an adult, anyone over 10 years old? And I looked at him in a quizzical way, and he said, we don't want you to fall out, mate. He said, how long have you been in Australia? And I said, I've only been here 2 days. And he said, who knows you're here? He didn't say, do you know anyone here? He said, who knows you're here? And I thought, what a strange question. And I said to him, well, I don't know anyone here in Australia. Suddenly he said, oh, I'm turning off here. So I said, well, I'm going to Cobar, so you can just drop me off. And instead of stopping, he continued down the road, maybe about 400 or 500 yards, driving slowly, looking in his rear view mirror. And then finally we stopped about 500 yards from the junction. And he said to me, I'm going to go down to Jenolan Forest. He said, if you want to drive along, you're welcome to. And he said, you can see some real Aussie wildlife. I looked at the map, and it was exactly the wrong direction to go to Cobar. So I said to him, no, I'm not going there. And he quickly jumped out and ran round the back of his vehicle. I didn't realize at the time that he grabbed the hammer from the tailgate, and then he came round to the side. And I'd realised then that he had no reason to get out that vehicle. And if he got out the vehicle and came round, there was going to be trouble. And it was just at that very moment, a long stream of traffic came down the road. Mallett was looking over his shoulder at the passing traffic and looking at me, wanting to strike, and he couldn't do what he wanted to do. And as I walked away, I got about 20 foot away, and I heard him call out, "Hey, mate." And I looked back, and he was lounging against the tailgate of his truck with a very frustrated, kind of wolfish look on his face. And he said something like, "Look after yourself, mate."
Years later, back home in England, Colin watched a documentary about the Belanglo killings and realised how close he came to being another victim of Ivan Milat.
When I saw him, he was in full predatory mode. He saw hitchhikers as a kind of an exotic form of wildlife that migrated through his territory, and he could just knock them off for dirty thrills, for sport. Mallett specifically told me he was going down into Janolan Forest to check his animal traps. And it was that very same Janolan Forest where Pt1 was found, stabbed and shot repeatedly. It seems more than a coincidence. You know, I survived. Ivan Milat.
Ivan Milat took his terrible secrets to the grave. Just how many people he killed will never be known. As our investigation continues, the body count is mounting.
So we have these three new cases where Mallett is a really strong suspect. We have Karen Rowland, Diane Panaccio, and Pt1.
Ivan Milat could have killed many other young travellers, including British, Dutch, German and American backpackers whose fate is still unknown. For years, Mallat's job as a road worker and interstate truck driver took him right around the country. That gave him the opportunity and knowledge of the areas where these victims disappeared.
I think there's a pretty good chance that Mallett has committed some other murders in particular. You've got to suppose that there may well be other bodies out there.
So let's look at the possibilities. North of Sydney, we've got Alan Fox and his girlfriend, Anika Adrianson. Then we've got schoolgirl Michelle Pope and her boyfriend, Stephen Lapthorne.
And then there's the American backpacker, Barbara Brown, and Annette Shirley Briffa.
Further north, we've got Narelle Cox, who disappeared whilst hitchhiking from Grafton to Noosa Heads.
And up in Queensland, there's three other potential victims. There's Lydia Knotts, the 21-year-old German backpacker, and the two friends, Robin Hoynville Bartram and Anita Cunningham, who disappeared whilst travelling from Melbourne to Bowen.
And south of Sydney, in the Canberra region, we have Karen Rowland, Elizabeth Herford and Mary Bertram. But there's also Diane Panaccio.
And not far on the south coast in Warilla, we have Kay Doherty and Tony Kavanagh, who disappeared in 1979. Now, this is a case that I feel is quite strong.
My name's Kevin Doherty. I'm Kay Doherty's twin brother. We were born 5 minutes apart, actually. Kay she'd stand out in the crowd, probably because of her bright red hair. She had bright red hair. It was pretty frizzy, I guess, or curly, whatever you want to call it. My hair was pretty similar back in them days. We sort of knew what each other were doing. We knew what each other were thinking at times. She was a pretty quiet girl. I reckon she was shy. She was more of a follower. She was never a leader. I know one thing I never forget, a memory, and she was scared of the dark. Even at that age, even if there was someone with her, she was scared of the dark. Kay was 15 years and 9 months old when she disappeared, just over 41 years ago, actually. She was supposed to go babysitting on that night, and I was supposed to pick her up that night. And from there, everything just went south.
Kay Doherty's companion on that night was Tony Kavanagh. She was 16, a fellow student at the local high school, and the opposite of Kay.
She was a little bit out there for her age. She's probably a little bit more mature than most kids at that time. At school, she was in trouble a lot. Tony, I don't like to say it, but it's the truth. Tony wanted to go to a disco in Wollongong. She had a boyfriend at the time. She asked all her friends. Her friends weren't allowed out. No one was allowed out after dark. And she's asked Kay if she'd want to come around her place at night. Kay would have been easily led. So whatever Tony had in mind, wherever they were heading to, Tony was leading the way and Kay was just following.
So Kay has gone over to Tony's house, supposedly to babysit, but Tony has different ideas.
Yeah.
She wants to go about 16 k's to Wollongong to a disco to meet some boys, and she's talked Kay into going along for moral support.
So it was right here at this bus stop, opposite the Warilla Grove Shopping Centre, on the 27th of July 1979. They were never seen again.
So this is literally the last place they were ever seen alive?
Yes. They disappeared.
I went around on my push bike around 9 o'clock and, to my despair, Tony's stepmother answered the door and virtually said to me, "The girls have gone to the movies." She said, "I just got home and the girls have gone to the movies." And I said, "What?" When I got home, I just said to Mum, I said, "Kay and Tony aren't there." And my mum just jumped up out of the seat and said, "What?" From there, frantically, my mum started ringing all Kay's friends, parents, and started asking were any of them girls with Kay and Tony. So from there, things just snowballed. By then, it was getting close to midnight. Mum started panicking. I knew something bad had happened. Police station was not far, so Mum and Dad and myself, we walked around to the police station. The police were just, without putting them down too much, they were terrible. They just told Mum she was a runaway. So from that minute we walked in the station to when we left, they had classed my sister as a runaway and come back in 24, 48 hours, they virtually said. From there, my mum was heartbroken. Yeah, she was devastated. Mum went home. She left the front light on. That front light stayed on for years. Every night she never turned that light off, hoping her daughter would come home.
So, could Kay Doherty and Tony Kavanagh have been taken to Belanglo like the 7 backpackers?
Well, Belanglo is just 75 kilometres up the Illawarra Highway, an easy drive, and Mallett was known to be working in this area at the time.
Ivan Mallett worked on the road gang at Kiama. Kiama is about 10 k's south of where we live, and the main highway was Shell Harbour Road where the girls were last seen. So apparently Ivan Mallett frequented Shell Harbour Road quite often. Police said this was his route, or he was known to be along that area. That's why they would have started investigating him, I guess.
All right, forward on the line, slow. Forward.
And then they started finding bodies in the Belanglo State Forest. Every time Mum heard something like that, she's up. And it's like, wow, is that my daughter? And then Ivan Milat was on the news virtually every second night. It was even before he was convicted. And then when they started talking about all the bones they were finding, well, Mum would jump out of her seat. I struggle with this, and I still struggle with it today. It absolutely ripped the heart and soul out of my mum. And I think what hurt most more than anything was Mum and Dad going to their grave, not knowing, having no answers.
Still to come, world experts.
There are possible other dumping grounds.
And revolutionary technology.
You can see through the canopy.
Provide vital new clues.
Extraordinary technology.
The disappearance of Kay Doherty and Tony Kavanagh is yet another unsolved case linked to serial killer Ivan Milat. Mysteries languishing in cold case files for years. Forgotten by everyone, except the grieving families.
I was always just sitting, waiting, wondering and hoping. But I knew something wasn't right. And I knew I wasn't going to see my twin sister again. I really knew that.
Serial killers are hard to catch. The first thing police do when they're investigating a murder is they look at the people who are around the person, who has the motive and the opportunity. When you're looking for a serial killer, you don't really get to do that.
Initial appearance was khaki to green type shorts, yeah.
Well, I think there are a number of factors why these murders have remained unsolved for so long. Firstly, Milat was a very lucky man. He got away with murder on at least 2 occasions, and probably more, we suspect. You also have to remember that scientific assistance such as DNA wasn't quite so good in those days as it was in later years. And also you didn't have the computer technology that they have now. The computer systems the police used in the early 1990s were quite simple, basically, and didn't give them the ability to cross-reference crimes and situations as much as they could do now.
These cold cases could finally be unlocked using today's technology. On the other side of the world, in the depths of a Canadian winter, an international expert in crime analysis joins the investigation to search for links between Milat and the growing list of new victims.
My name is Doug McGregor. I'm a geographic profiler in Ottawa, Canada. Geographic profiling looks at the spatial, temporal, environmental, and geographic elements of human behavior. Geoprofiling has really revolutionized policing methods because it allows them to really focus their investigations. It gives them better time management, it makes it more resourceful, more efficient, and it uses advanced software which the police did not have at their disposal decades ago. In a serial murder investigation, we are looking for linkages between the offender and the victims. Some of the information that I am trying to gather is the employment history of the offender, places where the offender has lived, routes they commonly take, homes of friends or family, or any place that the offender routinely visits. In terms of the victims, I'm looking for much the same information. Once I have this information, I input it into mapping software and create maps that I can provide to law enforcement. And this software also helps identify trends, patterns, and clusters. Geographic profiling can assist in the Ivan Mallett case in identifying which possible victims could be associated with Ivan Mallett and where those victims' bodies may be. Ivan Mallett's 7 known victims were found in Belanglo State Forest. That was his primary dumping ground. There are possible other body deposition sites that would likely have been the result of an opportunistic crime, such as Peter Letcher, Diane Panaccio, or Karen Rowland.
For a 50-year-old crime like Karen Rowland's murder, any fresh leads could help reignite the case.
I was involved a lot in the searching. We walked for weeks and weeks and weeks. We walked down the coast, from Canberra to the coast and back. She was found in a pine plantation, the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person.
At the time, Karen's inquest heard 4 different theories of how she died: suicide, septic abortion, drug overdose, or strangulation. Because she was killed in Canberra, the Australian Federal Police are responsible for Karen's case. Now, prompted by our investigation, they've agreed to take another look.
This is just some photos we found of Karen herself.
Oh, what a beautiful young woman, eh? Such a tragedy.
We're looking 50 years later at this point. What was the police theory at the time?
The inquest listed 4 possible causes of death. To me, there is one, and that is foul play. No doubt about that.
Did the coronial inquest name any potential suspects?
No.
So that's still kind of open. What do we know about the father of Karen's baby?
They were in a relationship, and that relationship broke up, but there was just nothing to indicate that he was the offender at the time.
Can you rule Mallett in or out?
He certainly wasn't a suspect at the time. There's some untested information, if you like, or some assertions that he might have been a possibility.
Certainly can't rule him in, can't rule him out.
A world away in the frozen reaches of Canada, environmental profiler Doug McGregor has been hard at work on the Mallett case. Using the latest profiling technology, he's searching for links between Australia's most notorious serial killer and a growing list of unsolved murders. Now, he's ready to report back with his findings.
So maybe it's best to start with the 3 main victims. That would be Karen Rowland, Peter Letcher, and Diane Panaccio. What did you find out?
Looking first at Karen Rowland, there were many similar environmental markers to Mallett's later known victims, which were found at Belanglo. She was found in a pine forest. She was found off of a trail covered in light debris. There were items strewn about the place. Some of her personal effects, specifically jewelry, were missing. The difficulty with Karen Rowland's case was that there's uncertainty surrounding Mallett's whereabouts during that time. The other difficulty was that strangulation wasn't one of Ivan Mallett's favored MOs in his later crimes. But because Karen Rowland's case happened quite a bit earlier, that MO may have evolved and he may have refined it over time. In my opinion, it's worth investigating Karen Rowland's case further, but it is, at this time, it is inconclusive as to whether he was definitively involved in her abduction and murder.
So where does Diane Panaccio fit into all of this?
Diane Panaccio's case resembles Mallat's later known victims fairly closely. She was murdered shortly after Everest, Gibson, and Schmidl, which puts her kind of right in the middle of Ivan Mallat's serial murder spree. And the circumstances of where she was found were very similar to that of those victims in Belanglo. She was found, again, in a pine forest off a fire trail, partly unclothed. There were items strewn about the place. She had jewelry stolen, similar to Karen Rowland's case. And she was stabbed in the thoracic region of the spine, which is very specific and was present in 6 or 7 of Ivan Mallat's known victims. In my opinion, Diane Panaccio was a victim of Ivan Mallat.
Do you think Peter Letcher could be one of Mallat's victims?
Peter Letcher is very high on potential victims of Ivan Mallat. Again, the environment was very similar. It was a pine forest. It was just north of Belanglo, an extension of that same forested area. He was found off a fire trail, partly clothed, covered in debris, items strewn about the place. And Ivan Mallat was familiar with Jenolan State Forest. Ivan Mallat was working in that area at the time, and he had previously visited the area on a leisurely basis as well. But I believe that Peter Letcher was an opportunistic crime, that Ivan Mallat came across him, he picked him up, he pursued to abduct him, and murder him in Jenolan State Forest.
So you're saying Jenolan then is maybe not where we should potentially look for other victims. So where would you suggest?
In my opinion, the search for more victims of Ivan Mallat should begin at Belanglo State Forest. Belanglo State Forest was Ivan Mallat's sanctuary. He knew the area well, he was comfortable there, he visited it often. He had property in that area. He hunted there. And he was never caught at the time, so he had no reason to leave.
Even for Doherty and Kavanaugh, if they were abducted by Mallat, it's a straight shot over to Belanglo.
So it is quite possible that Kay Doherty and Tony Kavanaugh were victims of Ivan Mallat.
Belanglo State Forest covers almost 4,000 hectares, a vast and remote killing ground for Ivan Mallat. Searching for new burial sites here is extremely difficult. But the investigation is about to break new ground, using a high-tech scanning system known as LiDAR to penetrate the dense trees and undergrowth. It's the first time Belanglo has ever been searched like this.
What we did was talk to an environmental profiler. What he's done is look at where the known 7 are located, the way the offender used space in that situation, and then has predicted the most likely areas to search. He's actually outlined these 2 areas as our priority search sites. Yep. So obviously you've got your drone here today. What is the process of actually looking to see if there are any likely areas there?
Right, so we're going to use LiDAR technology. The way it works is by sending a beam of light to an object and then measuring the time, how long it takes for it to return.
Does it then create like a 3D map of the topography?
Exactly. So including trees and everything around, including topography, you get a 3D representation of that.
So it's going to be quite densely forested in these areas. How is it going to cope with the actual foliage?
The main functionality of LiDAR is that it can see through the canopy. You can actually remove all the vegetation from your scan and have a look at terrain only and see all the bumps, pits, and depression in very high detail.
So there's no disguise with this? No hiding?
No.
If there's something there, we may find it.
Exactly. If you look closely, you'll find it.
The investigation is well underway with 3 very strong potential Mallett victims: Karen Rowland, Peter Letcher, and Diane Panaccio. Plus the 2 South Coast girls, Kay Doherty and Tony Kavanagh, who could have ended up at Belanglo as well. And Ivan Milat could be responsible for a long list of other unsolved murders.
This is the deepest anyone has ever dug into Ivan Milat's killing ground. This is the deepest anyone has ever dug into Ivan Milat's killing ground.
The new evidence revealing so many new victims of Ivan Milat.
The evidence points to him.
His murder spree began much earlier than anyone ever thought.
This is where things did get started for him.
The officers said, "You girls were a practice run."
Are there more bodies in Belanglo?
20 years of serial killing. A very strong case. Milat definitely did it.
More victims than anyone suspected.
If you follow this trail...
Look, you can actually see that.
And the groundbreaking technology revealing for the first time what's below the ground.
Police were flabbergasted. Knew something wasn't right.
I genuinely believe this case could now be solved.
7 News presents Ivan Milat, Buried Secrets. Next Sunday, 7 o'clock on